Okay, so in the previous presentation, we said that we were going to introduce hypothesis 3. But before we can get there, we're going to have to talk a little bit about some theory. And the idea is that it all starts with this idea of feet. And feet consist of syllables, namely 2 syllables per foot, and words consist of feet. So that's the idea, is that we need this intermediary step before we can get to the word, that syllables form feet and feet form words. All right, now that ends up being important in order to cast our hypothesis correctly. But before we can do that, we're going to need to introduce this idea of what exactly a foot is. And we're going to start with this idea of a trochee. Because remember, what I was saying in that previous presentation is that many people argue that English only consists of trochees, not iambs. So a trochee is stressed unstressed. Right? So that's our typical pattern. Better, ugly, evil. Now, Texas as well. You've got the stressed, unstressed. That's our typical pattern in English. Occasionally you might see what looks like an iamb. An iamb is unstressed, stressed. So that would be like depends. Now, many people would argue, though, and many linguists have argued, that iambs really don't exist in English per se. So what we're going to say then is that really we've got our definition of foot is going to be like this. I'm going to draw a tree for this to make it a little bit easier to understand. That a foot, first of all, consists of a stressed syllable. That there has to be a stressed syllable in it to be a foot. And that explains monosyllabic words, right? Words that only have one syllable. Still, if we say, as we are that there has to be a foot in between the syllable and the word, then monosyllabic words have to consist of a foot, and that means that a word like main and dog and hot and so on, that those have to have a foot in them that consists of exactly one syllable. So that stressed syllable is essential. And then we're going to use parentheses to indicate that this second one is optional. And so it can be followed by an unstressed syllable. And what you get then is this stressed, unstressed pattern in some words that would be, for example, better and evil and Texas and Kansas. All of those are going to have that stressed, unstressed pattern. Then, of course, we see, once we get to more complex words, like Alabama, then you're going to have 2 feet. So you're going to have a foot followed by a foot. And in the case of Alabama, you've got stressed. I'm just going to do STR now. And then unstressed. Stressed, unstressed. And so what happens is, to form the word, we've got to combine those 2 feet together, and up here you get the word. So that would be Al, La, Bam, Ma. Nice 2-foot word, Alabama. And what we're going to say now is that our third hypothesis, and let's go ahead and write this, hypothesis 3 is only insert fucking between feet. Now that's a pretty good hypothesis, right? So it automatically captures our hypothesis number 1, which was only insert fucking between syllables, not, in other words, not within a syllable. Well, since, as we've seen, foot consists of syllables, if you can only get fucking between the feet in a position like this, then obviously it can't come within a syllable. So the nice thing is that hypothesis 3 automatically captures hypothesis 1. It also is nice because, as we're saying, there are some words, like Utah, that may consist of just a stressed and a stressed syllable. Each one of those are a foot by themselves, forming, of course, a word, and that's going to give you ta. And our hypothesis is that we can get a foot in between, or a fucking between those 2 feet, and so then you can get you fucking ta. All right. Now, that's looking pretty good, right? Now, the problem, of course, is what do we do with examples like Vermont, right? Because Vermont, remember, has this unstressed followed by a stressed syllable, right? So you've got this ver there that's unstressed followed by mont. But as we were saying, our feet in English, we're arguing, can only be trochaic or consist of a single syllable, in which case our only option is to say that that's a foot right there, that mont is our foot, and ver over here, it's just not anything, right? It's not attached to any foot. And so one possibility here would be to say that those stray unstressed syllables don't have to be attached to a foot, that maybe it just connects like this, that those unstressed syllables can attach up there and give us a word by themselves, and you get then Vermont. All right, now that's a possibility, and then what we've seen is that if you want to insert fucking in here, well, you've got to turn that ver into a foot, and the only way that you can do that is to make it strong, to make it stressed, and then you can make it into a foot, and now you can insert fucking in there, and it sounds pretty good. Ver fucking mont. All right, so that all seems pretty good. Now, there is another question, which is, what do you do with something like Florida? Oops. Right? Because Florida has this strange pattern. You've got stressed syllable there, get an unstressed, and then an unstressed, right? So we've got then a stressed, unstressed pattern. That makes a nice foot. And as we were just saying, that unstressed syllable must just attach up there, right? That you get then Florida, where the da, that unstressed syllable there, just attaches straight up to the word. And if that's the case, we should predict that you should not be able to get fucking after the flora. Flora fucking da. Right? Now, I find that that sounds pretty bad, pronounced the way I just did. Flora fucking da. Right? But if we change the pronunciation a little bit and do the Vermont move again, where we strengthen this and give it a little bit of stress, then we can make a foot out of that single syllable down there, duh, and all of a sudden it starts to sound a lot better to insert it right here. Flora fucking duh, right? And I've heard people pronounce it that way. So I don't think anybody, if they're going to get fucking in there, are going to pronounce it Flora fucking duh. But you can get Flora fucking duh. Right? So that's the point, is that in order to kind of license it, you have to create a new foot in there. And I think that's really the main takeaway from this, is that in order to make sense of fucking insertion, we have to accept this notion of foot. And we have to accept that in English, we divide all of our words into syllables first, and then those syllables combine together to form feet, and those feet combine together to form words. You can have a foot that consists of only a single syllable, that's fine, but it seems that the largest foot that we can get in English may be just a two-syllable, one stressed followed by an unstressed syllable, and that's our maximum foot. And anytime that we've got a fucking insertion, it's got to be coming between 2 feet. Now there is one more issue though, and that's with some of these kind of strange words. You don't find very many of these words in English, but here's one that I like. This is a town in Michigan. Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo, where you've got nice stress on Cal, you got some secondary stress on zoo, and then you've got 2 unstressed syllables there. The Kalamazoo. So Kalamazoo. Now, the thing though is that we've got a nice foot here, and we've got a nice foot here, and we've got the word there with one, I should say, stray syllable. So we've got Kala forms a foot, Zoo forms a foot because it's a stressed syllable by itself, and then that M in the middle just has to go straight up to the word. So then the question that we have to ask is, can fucking come inside of that word, Kalamazoo? Can you have a fucking in there? Well, I can. I don't know, you can test this on your own intuitions, but for me, it sounds pretty good to say Kala-fucking-mazoo. Kala-fucking-mazoo. Sounds pretty good to me. But interestingly, also sounds pretty good to say Kalama-fucking-zoo. Kalama-fucking-zoo. Either one of those sounds equally fine to me. I know some people prefer one over the other. When we've done this in face-to-face classes, we found that there's actually a divide, that some people in the class like both of them equally. Some people in the class prefer one over the other. Some people prefer Kala-fucking-mazoo, and others prefer Kalama-fucking-zoo. And but interestingly, it seems that just about everybody agrees that either one is acceptable. Either one is okay. One might be slightly better than the other, but either one seems to be okay. And so it seems that in some way that ma, that unstressed syllable in there, is almost invisible to the process. That really, as long as it's coming between these 2 solid feet, the Kala and the Zoo, it doesn't really matter where the ma comes in there. So, what we find is that even with these sort of odd words where you get that floating unstressed syllable, our hypothesis still seems to work remember our hypothesis. Let me see if I can find it again. There it is. Hypothesis 3, that you can only insert fucking between feet. And that's going to be our end. And I'm just going to end it on one last comment, which is that this, as I've said earlier, this is something that you were never taught, right? Nobody ever sat you down and explained to you where fucking can be inserted in words. I can be absolutely certain that you never had a teacher who gave a lesson on what was correct and what was incorrect with fucking insertion. And yet we all have these really strong intuitions about what sounds right and what doesn't sound right with fucking insertion. And more than that, it has to do with something that most of us are completely unaware of. We might be aware of syllable structure, but at least consciously, we're not aware of foot structure. And I think that's really interesting, that our minds at that subconscious level are breaking these words into feet without us consciously being aware that they are. And more than that, part of the discovery of that came from this fucking insertion, that linguists had been hypothesizing that there was this intermediary level of foot, but to find concrete evidence to support that idea took a while. And one of the early papers in the 1980s used fucking insertion to make the argument that we have to accept that foot structure is part of our word structure. So in that way, this swearing is actually informing our understanding of how language works, at a descriptive level, that to understand how language works, we actually had to go to swearing to find good concrete evidence to support our theory. And I think that's kind of cool.